I'm Errol Barnett at the CBS Broadcast Center in New York. You are looking live at the Senate chamber floor as senators become jurors for the impeachment trial of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Scott MacFarlane and Nikole Killion are on Capitol Hill helping us understand every minute of what really impacts everyone in the country. Scott, I understand, based on what a producer there, Laura Garrison on the floor, is sharing with us, that some senators are sharing notes, signing bits of paper. There seems to be a pamphlet that's being passed around. What should we make of any early conversations or jockeying on the floor to get a sense of what might happen next?
You're looking at 100 Americans who just got jury duty. Welcome to the club. There are many things you cannot do when you're on jury duty, especially in the unique circumstance of being a senator during an impeachment trial. They're not going to be able to bring in their laptops and do the things they want to do. Zoom interviews, Zoom meetings. They have to sit and listen and be attentive for a process that they all know is not headed towards a conviction. This is not going to be a trial with action. This may not be a trial at all. So there's an idleness that is probably going to overpower them in the next few minutes if it hasn't already. But there's also all this pressing business coming their way from the U.S. House. This new set of legislation for funding Ukraine, funding Israel, potentially banning TikTok. All of that's being queued up right now. Could come to a vote in the House by Saturday. And the Senate is idle as long as it's sitting as a jury. So a note passing to a degree is to be expected, if not encouraged.
Scott, thank you for that. Nikole, we just saw Republican Senator Marco Rubio. We just saw Senator Bernie Sanders sign in. They're now becoming jurors in this process, so not too many more senators to go. Help us understand the next stage of this, which I understand will be Democratic Senate Leader Chuck Schumer taking the floor. Is that right? Or are there more procedural points to hit?
Well, likely we will see kind of more procedural action after this. Again, it's possible we will hear the Senate Sergeant of Arms make a proclamation once that oath book has been signed. But furthermore, it then comes down to how will this trial operate and run. And so that's where, the Senate is expected to potentially consider some organizational motions or what's called, points of order or approval of orders. So it's possible that there could be a point of order made to perhaps move forward with some type of debate, or we could see a point of order to move forward with a motion to dismiss, or again, to table this to a trial committee, which can happen with impeachment trials, or they can decide that they want to proceed. Now, if they do proceed, as we have noted, the 11 House impeachment managers do not appear to be in the Senate chamber, so we're not really expecting a trial to get underway in full in the sense of arguments being presented to the U.S. Senate. What they must first decide, again, is how they will organize this process and procedure going forward. And since Leader Chuck Schumer is the leader of the U.S. Senate and of the Democratic majority, he will likely kind of take the lead here in terms of determining the next steps.
And what do we know about the impeachment managers and the role that we will witness them play here in the next few hours or so? Why is it key to keep an eye out for them, and what might they do when they do arrive?
Well, again, their role is largely complete. They did their job yesterday in terms of transmitting or delivering those articles of impeachment. 11 House managers, impeachment managers in all, that walked those articles over to the U.S. Senate. Again, one of those articles being for the willful and systemic refusal to comply with the law. The second article being a breach of public trust on the part of Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Again, the Department of Homeland Security has dismissed these proceedings as baseless in an attempt to smear the secretary, but this largely stems from a year-long investigation that was conducted by the House Homeland Security Secretary the Homeland Security Committee into the Secretary and his handling of the U.S.-Mexico border. So that's kind of what brought us to this moment. And don't forget that in the House, when the Secretary was impeached, the House had to hold 2 votes to get to this point, because there was one vote that failed because they did not have enough support, and Democratic Congressman Al Green, who was hospitalized at the time, had to run over, took an Uber over to the Capitol, basically sinking the first vote to impeach Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, and then the House voted about a week or so later, once they had a higher head count. At the time, Majority Leader Steve Scalise had been out recovering from blood cancer and had been receiving treatment. So as soon as he was declared fully recovered, he rushed back to the Capitol, and that's when they held this impeachment vote back in February that ultimately succeeded by just 1 vote, enabling these articles of impeachment to move forward. And so, again, due to debate over government funding and making sure the government was funded, transmitting those articles were put on hold for several weeks until we got to the point yesterday where those House impeachment managers delivered them. Now, in the course of a trial, if it were to move forward, it would look similar to, for instance, the impeachment trials that we saw with former President Trump, where these impeachment managers will be serving as prosecutors, if you will, making the case for these articles of impeachment and presenting evidence from their year-long investigation as to why they believe that there was a dereliction of duty at the U.S.-Mexico border on the part of Secretary Mayorkas, and why they believe it does rise to that level of an impeachable offense. So that is the scenario if a trial moves forward. Let's take a listen to the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Nikole.
Make the fact known to the chair so that the oath may be administered as soon as possible to the senator.
The Sergeant at Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silent under pain of imprisonment while the Senate of the United States is convened as a court of impeachment to consider the articles of impeachment against Alejandro N. Mayorkas, Secretary of Homeland Security.
Madam President.
Majority Leader is recognized.
In a moment, I will ask unanimous consent to allow for debate time, to allow for Republicans to offer and have votes on trial resolutions, and allow for Republicans to offer and have votes on points of order. So, I ask unanimous consent that Senator Lee be recognized to offer a resolution that is the text of SRES 624, the full Senate trial, that Senator Cruz be recognized to offer a resolution that is the text of SRES 622, the trial committee, that there then be up to 60 minutes of debate on the resolutions, concurrently and equally divided between the 2 leaders or their designees, and following the use or yielding back of that time, the Senate vote on or in relation to the resolutions in the order listed, with no amendments to the resolutions in order. Further, that following the disposition of the trial resolutions, if they are not agreed to, Senator Schumer or his designee be recognized to make a motion to dismiss the first article of impeachment, that the motion be subject to only 7 points of order, that there be up to 60 minutes for debate, concurrently and equally divided on the motion to dismiss and the points of order, and that following the use or yielding back of that time, the Senate vote in relation to the points of order in the order raised and the motion to dismiss. Further, that if Senator Schumer or his designee makes a motion to dismiss the second article of impeachment, that the motion be subject to only 1 point of order, that there be up to 60 minutes for debate, concurrently and equally divided, on the motion to dismiss and the points of order, and that following the use or yielding back of that time, the Senate vote in relation to the points of order in the order raised and the motion to dismiss. Following that further disposition of Article 2, the Senate vote on the motion to adjourn the Court of Impeachment sine die. Finally, that there be up to 4 minutes for debate equally divided between the 2 leaders or their designees prior to each roll call vote, all without intervening action or debate.
Is there an objection?
Madam President.
Senator from Missouri.
Reserving my right to object. To dismiss or table articles of impeachment against Secretary Mayorkas without a trial here today or in committee is an unprecedented move by Senator Schumer. Never before in the history of our republic has the Senate dismissed or tabled articles of impeachment when the impeached individual was alive and had not resigned. As Senator Schumer said in 2020, quote, "A fair trial has witnesses. A fair trial has relevant documents as part of the record. A fair trial seeks the truth. Nothing more, nothing less." I will not assist Senator Schumer in setting our Constitution ablaze and bulldozing 200 years of precedent. Therefore, I object.
Madam President.
Objection is heard.
Madam President, I raise a point of order that Impeachment Article 1 does not allege conduct that rises to the level of a high crime or misdemeanor as required under Article 2, Section 4 of the United States Constitution, and is therefore unconstitutional.
Under the precedents and practices of the Senate, the chair has no power or authority to pass on such a point of order. The chair, therefore, under the precedents of the Senate, submits the question to the Senate. Is the point of order well taken? The Republican leader is recognized. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
All right, as expected, some early tussling there between Democrats and Republicans as the impeachment trial of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas gets underway after about, an hour of senators entering the room, signing the oath book and being sworn in. They have now all become jurors in this significant impeachment trial. We saw Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, the Democrat, begin by making an argument that he effectively wanted to table or dismiss these articles of impeachment. I did also hear him reference time for debate to be split between Democrats and Republicans. And then we heard an objection from a Republican and a retort from Senator Schumer. Our congressional correspondent, Nikole Killion, is there watching all of this as well. Nikole, can you better help us understand what we just witnessed?
Well, what we witnessed is pretty much what we previewed, in the sense that we knew that this next phase would be about how this trial should or shouldn't be organized. And so you heard Leader Schumer there make a suggestion that he would allow two senators, Senator Mike Lee of Utah, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, to kind of present resolutions to the Senate, enable time for debate for those. We believe those amendments would involve moving forward with a full trial, and then following that debate, that they would then try to hold a vote on dismissing the first article of impeachment, followed by the second article of impeachment. And so you heard Leader Schumer there lay out some parameters, not only for the debate, but how many motions could be offered, how many points of order, which, is not worth getting into the weeds on that, but just kind of laying out the guidelines for how this debate may proceed. And you heard that objection there from Missouri Senator Eric Schmidt, basically outlining some of the arguments that we discussed, that many Senate Republicans would like to see a full trial, but at the same time they question the point of having a debate if Leader Schumer is going to move to dismiss this anyway. You also heard the senator argue that this would break with precedent of over 200 years to not move forward with a trial. But as we have previously discussed, Leader Schumer made clear in his remarks that these charges against Mayorkas don't rise to an impeachable offense, and in his view are unconstitutional. So that is why he is moving to dismiss. His concern, of course, is setting the precedent of having a trial over a policy disagreement when it comes to the border and potentially any other issues going forward. That, the Senate could be forced into this position in the future every time that there is a policy disagreement. So that was a little bit of the discussion that you heard on the floor there. And of course, now they are in the process of taking a vote as to how they will proceed, whether or not this objection will be upheld by the senator from Missouri, or whether or not they will move forward with the plan that Leader Schumer outlined in terms of allowing some debate and ultimately this potential vote on a motion to dismiss.
And for viewers just joining us, it's just past 2 p.m. here on the East Coast. I'm Errol Barnett at the CBS Broadcast Center in New York. Nikole Killion is there on Capitol Hill as we watch the Senate trial, impeachment trial of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas get underway. To your point, Nikole, we had been, you, myself, Scott MacFarlane, spoke for about an hour before things got underway, anticipating this very moment in which both sides would need to come to an agreement in how to proceed. We just heard Senator Pat Murray, the Democrat from Washington, who's president pro tempore, say that it's not her place or position as chair of these proceedings to decide how to proceed. And then senators then have to get together and vote and huddle. We're watching this split-screen huddle on the screen with us now. I see Senator Ted Cruz, among other Republicans, and the Republican leader Mitch McConnell there. Apart from Democrats who were on the other side of the room speaking to each other, we knew this was coming. We expected this to happen, Nikole. So what likely are they trying to figure out right now?
Again, I think it's whether, because obviously before Leader Schumer presented this path forward, I mean, he did have to secure some type of agreement from Senate Republicans to see if this might be amenable. I mean, usually we see this in another form when the Senate takes up major pieces of legislation. They have to reach what is called a time agreement, and that is usually done before they move ahead with debate on the floor, kind of similar to in the House, where the House Rules Committee sets the rules for debate on how certain legislation will proceed. Obviously, we're not talking about legislation from the standpoint of impeachment, but usually, you have to secure some type of agreement about the path forward before you present it on the floor. So there could be some discussion there on the floor, again, about how they want to move forward. I mean, when Leader Schumer said that he would allow Senators Cruz and Lee to present their resolutions, that was likely with the assumption that he had perhaps ahead of time secured an agreement with Senate Republican leadership that he was going to allow these two Republican senators to move forward with their resolutions. And so this really comes down to Senate Republicans deciding if they want to go along with this plan or if they want to continue to object. So as you know, the Senate is a deliberative body, and so this, once again, is kind of a moment of deliberation as they determine the path forward.
Would we not have expected Senators McConnell and Schumer to have communicated ahead of this, or to have telegraphed perhaps some limitations or boundaries that this could have continued within?
Possibly, and again, that is pretty standard when they come to these time agreements. But again, this is understanding that this process is a little different in terms of impeachment than what we usually see legislatively. But we do know, of course, within the last 24 hours that there had been some, closed-door discussions about the potential for allowing debate, how much time might be allowed, and the like. And so up until this point, we kind of didn't know know what those particulars might be. But again, we heard Leader Schumer a short time ago kind of outline that he would potentially allow Senator Mike Lee to present a resolution and to allow time for debate on that. I think he said up to 60 minutes on each resolution, concurrently divided between the parties. The same for Senator Ted Cruz in terms of him presenting a resolution. But regardless of these resolutions, you also heard the leader make clear that he would then move for a motion to dismiss, which is what we expected, because he has made crystal clear that he wants this matter resolved quickly. And again, that's where there's a little split among some Senate Republicans, because while yes, many of them, the majority of them, would like to move forward with a trial, you know, some of them question this exercise of having a debate around it if the leader is going to try to squash this anyway.
And we can see a little bit of movement as they break, Republicans and Democrats breaking from their huddles at the moment. And Nikole, a reason we're watching this so closely is because the business of the country isn't being done. Remind us why the timing of this happening today specifically is significant, and what other business and bills are not being considered while the Senate focuses on this impeachment trial.
Well, the business of the people are still getting done. And keep in mind, from the point of Senate Republicans, they want this trial to happen because they want to lay out to the American people what they believe is a failure at the U.S.-Mexico border. But again, you have Senate Democrats who feel this is nothing but a stunt and a waste of time, and that, yes, they need to take up other legislative matters, whether that is, you know, additional funding for Israel, Ukraine, the Indo-Pacific, which again are measures the Senate has already considered, but now it has taken a different form in the House, where the Senate may have to reconsider that. You know, almost every day the Senate moves ahead with nominations for judges and various administration officials. So again, that is work that kind of stalls out in the process. And we know that the Senate has a very lengthy agenda beyond that. Of course, now that we've gotten through government funding, you know, there is the matter of, for instance, what to do with TikTok. That was kind of a big talker before the Easter recess. We know the House, for instance, passed legislation, may even bring up additional legislation potentially to ban the social media platform. And so again, how the Senate moves forward on that type of legislation is something they can't do if they're in the middle of an impeachment trial. But this is all part of their job, you know, whether it's impeachment, whether it is legislative functions. And so that is why there has been this debate, not only leading up to the trial, but one that we're witnessing on the House floor about the merits of moving forward with a trial and whether it should be considered, because some do view this as a very serious task, while others feel, again, that this is just more of a political stunt.
And you did say earlier, Nikole, that the Senate is a deliberative body, and they will take their time to deliberate and discuss things among each other. There's only so much we can pull from watching the senators huddle and chat and walk from place to place. But as you mentioned, for Republicans, this is central. This is key. This is an issue they believe that voters should be aware of where they stand and how unhappy they are with President Biden's Homeland Security Secretary. As we wait and watch, I'm guessing you don't have the answer to this question, but how much more time do you think it will take until they get back to the microphone and let us know what's happening?
Well, you know, that is a tough one to answer, because there are times where we have seen votes left open for hours. So hopefully it doesn't take them hours to reach a resolution and a conclusion here. But again, you know, this is, you know, the people's government in action, where we do see lawmakers oftentimes huddled on the floor, trying to reach agreement or, you know, come up with another arrangement or possible deal. It's just kind of what they do. So while it may seem like watching paint dry, you know, there is a method to the madness here. And again, obviously, this is a very consequential step, whatever it may be. Again, if they decide to dismiss this trial outright, which really hasn't happened before, or if they decide to proceed with one, which could potentially stall other legislative business. this.
That's right. And as Nikole has so eloquently laid out, the Democratic Senate leader, Chuck Schumer, opened this trial by giving options to Republicans to make their case, but then he wanted to table the articles of impeachment, to table or dismiss. And to that, Republican Senator Eric Schmitt basically said, absolutely not. I object. That's tantamount to, in his words, setting the Constitution ablaze. So from the jump, the two sides not close to an agreement, and that is what senators are debating and discussing now. Our congressional correspondent, Nikole Killion, thank you so much for walking us through what we've been witnessing. But as we continue to monitor what will happen in the Senate, we'll take a very short break and bring you updates on this very important story throughout the afternoon.